Good evening, everyone. I'm glad you're all here, and I think we're going to have a great panel. I'm Ravi Sarathy, professor in the International Business and Strategy Department, and we're going to be talking about globalization, how globalization is changing, and what it means for companies trying to do business across borders, what it means for trying to do global innovation, particularly teams across borders, the role of the US dollar, how global payments are critical, and what the US dollar means for global payments. Perhaps that's changing. And then we have David Vitti from Bose, who's going to be talking about how all of this might relate to real life, what he does at Bose Corporation, and how global procurement is changing, and how some of these factors, some of these changes in the global environment might be affecting how you strategize and implement global procurement. So first, Mike, you want to start?
Sure. Michael Enright, DMSB. Before joining the faculty here 4 years ago, I had spent the previous 24 years on the ground in Asia with a professorship at the University of Hong Kong, but actually spending the vast majority of my time advising multinational companies, governments on attracting multinational companies, and being a board director of a number of companies with global operations. So I'd like to share some perspectives based on that background. I'll focus a bit on China up front. And of course, China's been one of the major business stories, international business stories for decades. But China's economy is slowing. There's a property bubble that's deflating. The population of working age is now declining. The impact of COVID is still rippling through the economy. Economic nationalism is growing. East-West tensions are growing. And China's own priorities are shifting from headline economic growth to greater technological self-sufficiency. And this is creating changes. And while China may become the world's largest economy, the current trends suggest that China is not going to become the dominant economy that a number of analysts were projecting just a few years ago. At the same time, Chinese companies are becoming more efficient, making competition tougher, profits in China more difficult. They're actually the leaders in e-marketing, e-advertising, and AI addressing the market in that part of the world. You also have the diplomacy, where some foreign firms have been targeted for, let's just say, less than favorable treatment. And this is going on as well. It's increasing the uncertainty associated with China operations. So from a business standpoint, a geopolitical standpoint, a resilience standpoint, the China equation is actually changing. It's evolving. It's not quite the same as it used to be. It's still the big game in the region, but it's not the only game. And what that means is opportunity for other places, Southeast Asia, India, Eastern Europe, Latin America, Africa, to become more important in international supply chains and in the strategies of multinational companies. Some of the opportunities are absorbing some of the activities, production activities coming out of China, some that seek low wages, some that seek resilience, and some that want a friend shore to make sure they're in a politically favorable environment if we see the world economy starting to bifurcate and decouple. And these, of course, are changing the way companies think, where you configure, where you host your data, what financial services you use, where you route them through. And that's creating one set of challenges. But there's another almost larger issue as well. As Ravi Ramamurthy started us with, we're seeing a change in the global configuration. The US and Western Europe historically were 50–60% of the world economy and could pretty much set the rules of the game for international trade and investment. If the projections that my group is doing come true, we'll actually see both US and China having about 22–23% of the world economy. You'll see Western Europe at about 12%, other westernized economies, Japan, Australia, et cetera, about 10%, India 10% and growing, rest of the world around 20-something%. And that's almost the definition of the multipolar world that, again, Ravi started us with. And we don't know what that world is going to look like. We don't know if we're going to have a unified investment and trade regime under a rules-based system or a fragmented, chaotic might makes right system. US and China will be the most important players, but it's actually the decisions of the EU, India, and some of the other countries that may actually tip the balance one way or another. So for firms, that means on top of the complexity introduced by AI, sustainability issues, and the usual competitive technological and workforce challenges, it means they have to add these other dimensions as they rethink their international configurations, their supply chains, and also their relations with stakeholders both in their home markets and in their foreign markets. And as doubts about the wisdom of globalization grow, they're going to have to up their game in terms of making their case, showing the value that they are creating for their home and host environments. And our research suggests that firms are actually really bad at that. For example, US firms, our estimates are that for every dollar of profit a US firm generates in China or India, they generate about $13 to $20 or more in GDP impact on the local economy. And very few companies understand how to do that analysis and how to communicate that out. It was a startling number for all that we presented it to, including senior officials in the Chinese government, the US government, and the US firms themselves. And we're actually helping a number of firms do that estimate to prove their worth to their environments. So the world that I see is one where the economic, geopolitical, and governance features of the whole international economy are changing. The added complexity may be great for us researchers and consultants, but my apologies to our guests, it's a much tougher environment for you. Thank you.
Thank you. Samina, you want to talk a little bit about global R&D innovation?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Samina Karim. I'm the Group Chair for Entrepreneurship and Innovation, and my area is competitive and corporate strategy with the focus on acquisitions and alliances. So Michael got us off to a great start talking about the changing landscape, and I want to highlight how these shifts really are going to affect businesses, I think, in two significant ways. The first is simply the relevance of global markets, and so businesses can't afford to ignore competition in many of these other countries that are becoming highly active. And at the same time, they can't afford to not capture market share in the emerging economies. On the competition front, I want to highlight that, for example, we see countries like China that used to be a leading player not only in industries such as garments or in common electronics, but we see that they're now very forward-looking, and they're market leaders in markets such as solar panels and rechargeable batteries. China now is the largest producer of solar panels with 80% market share. And so as the world continues to move towards harnessing sustainable energy sources, we know that countries certainly don't want to be dependent on other nations, and so want to support the rise of their own domestic industries that can compete in the global landscape. And so this ties back a little to what Ravi mentioned about some protectionism kind of tendencies that I expect that we'll see more of in the coming years. And just as countries and their domestic firms can't ignore competition from other markets for the products and services they create, they also need to be active players in these markets to capture market share. So for example, if you're a firm in the luxury goods market and you've been focusing on Western Europe and the US, it would be awry if you didn't focus on South Korea. That is one of the fastest growing markets for luxury goods. So it's a global marketplace out there. Not only are you facing the competition from those markets, but you're also facing market share that you want to capture in those markets. The second way that I think this changing landscape is going to affect businesses is how they get work done. And specifically what I'm talking about here is the use of acquisitions and alliances as a mechanism strategically to be more competitive and innovative. And so whereas firms once sought alliance partners or acquisition targets in various parts of the world, now with some deteriorating relationships between NATO-based countries and countries like China and Russia, this is going to have an immediate impact on interorganizational relationships. So if firms face greater uncertainty and risk due to these political tensions, then we can expect less foreign direct investment in certain parts of the world and countries potentially blocking cross-border acquisitions. We're already starting to see it here in the US when they're looking at acquisitions that are coming from firms that are in China or based in Russia. So I expect, and based on my research, that if there's a drop in acquisition activity globally, especially in certain regions, then firms are more likely to face a greater reliance on alliances. And alliances raise a whole other set of issues for businesses and managers because they have to be cautious about avoiding things like adverse selection of partners, and specifically holdup by partners, where they might be then faced with bottlenecks in how they do their activities and their global operations. So I'll close with this. We were asked today by Ravi to address whether global business is more or less important than ever before. Personally, I'll reiterate that I think it's more important than ever. However, due to political shifts, that firms are facing now more constraints on where and how to compete. They may also face fewer choices in the partnerships that they once were able to do in certain parts of the world, and maybe other partnerships in other emerging markets, such as Brazil, India, Eastern Europe, are going to be even more important because of the limited set of partnerships that they can now pursue.
Thank you, Samina. My name is Fabrice Chomody. I'm part of the finance group here at DMSB. My research focuses on international finance, asset pricing, and market microstructure issues. And I would like to pick up on the last point that Samina has mentioned. So if you think about mergers and acquisitions, you also have to think about funding markets. Now, what's really prevalent here is that if you look at the amount of debt that is outstanding and issued by foreign countries in foreign currencies, it's really the US dollar that stands out. It's around $11.5 trillion in terms of total amount, and roughly 60% of that is issued in US dollars. So the US dollar has this dominant role in our global monetary and financial system, not only when it comes to this funding market, which is important when you think about mergers and acquisitions, but the dollar takes a similarly dominant role in other areas as well. You could think about, for instance, real trade, financial trade, but even the currency market itself. Now, it's important to bear in mind that this hasn't been always the case. So if we go back a little bit in history, essentially pre-World War I, you will notice that the pound sterling has played a similar dominant role in the monetary and policy financial system of that time. Now, the question is, okay, why did it shift from the pound sterling back then to the US dollar essentially after World War II and with the establishing of the Bretton Woods system? And the key here is that we had two large shocks during that time period. We had World War I, we had World War II. After World War II, the UK had lost a lot of its economic power. Many of the former colonies became independent, and all of that had an impact on the role of the pound sterling. Now, looking a bit more forward, do we see any alternatives to the US dollar? There's two other currencies that immediately come to our mind. One of them is the euro. The European economy is smaller than the US economy, but it is very well developed. It has a large financial sector if you think about London, Frankfurt, Zurich, and other places in Europe. But there is an issue with Europe in the sense that after the sovereign debt crisis, there was a lack of trust in the euro as a reserve currency. So when we look at the amount of currency that central banks are essentially holding, we again see a dominance of the US dollar and decline of the euro. So what's the other alternative? Well, we could look at developing economies, and in particular, we could look at China. The tricky part there is that precisely the policies that are fostering the Chinese economy, that are bolstering it, that are protecting it from essentially spillover effects from US monetary policy, for instance, speaking about capital controls, are also the ones that are preventing it from becoming a real contestant of the US dollar as a dominant currency. In particular, some of my own research is showing that what you need in order to have a shift from equilibrium, so from this dollar-denominated equilibrium to, say, a euro or renminbi-denominated equilibrium, is a large shock. Now, large shock doesn't have to be always negative. It can also be something innovative related to technology. And this is where I would like to hand over to Ravi, because he's going to give us some insights about cryptocurrencies.
Thank you. I think the interesting question about global reserves and the role of the US dollar is that It's not just that it's the most prevalent currency. Last week the BRICS had a meeting and they thought about trying to come up with an alternative to the US dollar. But the heart of it is nobody wants somebody else's currency. China would like the yuan to be the global reserve currency, and so would India, and so would Brazil. So what's been happening is a kind of alternative movement, saying we don't really need governments to try to create currencies to manage global payments. Instead, let's create an alternative set of currencies, which are really digital currencies. You all heard of Bitcoin? Bitcoin's been around for about 14 years, since 2009. And its market capitalization is about $1 trillion. Okay? That's surprising, a completely artificial currency. From that, we started getting stable coins, which are the idea that you make digital currencies linked to fiat, linked to currencies like the US dollar, but which are not as subject to regulations by countries, so they can be easily, instantaneously, and very low-cost transfers with immediate confirmation. And then we have governments reacting to that, saying, we don't want to lose control of our money supply and monetary policy, so let's start trying to create government-sponsored digital currencies, what are called central bank digital currencies. Now, that in turn raises a very interesting question. What is the backbone of all of this globalization? Whether it's trying to decide how to balance relationships, economic and manufacturing relationships in China with other countries, whether it is to try to find alliance and acquisition candidates in different parts of the world, and then of course managing relationships with them, or how to manage the future of global payments. And I think the heart of this is networks. You may have heard of CrowdStrike. CrowdStrike is a company that does cybersecurity, and about 3 months ago, they issued a software update, and it was faulty. It was human error, by the way, and networks crashed, and it caused havoc around the world. Major airlines had to stop flying for a day or two, sometimes for a week. Hospitals couldn't function properly. Government organizations couldn't function properly. Multinationals couldn't communicate in many cases. So I think what is important to recognize is that when you're in the real world, like David Weedy is going to tell us about, you need those global communication networks to be able to, for example, create digital twins, which are simulated digital representations of products, which allow companies such as Bose to work with partners and suppliers and in real time create new versions, follow the engineering, follow the prototypes, follow the production, and manage inventory, pipelines, and supply chains. So let me turn it over to David, and perhaps you can reflect on what we've been talking, but also talk about how you actually do manage the global procurement process at Bose.
Thank you, Ravi. Dave Vitti, I lead global procurement for Bose Corporation. I'll first say that you guys are in great hands. Everything that this panel is talking about is all extremely relevant to real life, day-to-day activities that corporations are facing. So consider yourselves lucky and give these guys a round of applause, because I could use them all on my staff for any time. So
You've just lost all credibility with the audience.
So what does this all mean for a company like Bose and global procurement and networks, and how do we manage through this? If you rewind back to COVID, right? Everybody remembers COVID. It was pretty brutal. It was brutal for me. It was brutal for other companies. It was brutal on supply chain networks. But we learned a lot, right? We learned how not to be dependent on one country. We learned on how not to be dependent on certain partners. We learned what risk and resiliency really is. Those are just buzzwords, right? Risk, resiliency. But we learned how to put plans in place, right, to mitigate from a crisis like COVID happening again. And COVID is just one example. So what are we focused on today? You heard a little bit about the China market. You heard a little bit of Michael say it's soft in China. It is soft in China. I'll say, controversially of popular demand, it is a great time to do business in China. I haven't seen prices like this since pre-COVID. It's a great time to be there. I've been traveling to China for over 25 years. I went back for the first time after COVID. I had to stay here for 4 years. I usually go about 3 to 4 times a year. My first trip after COVID, I was extremely impressed with all the infrastructure investments they've made, the cleanliness of the cities, the talent, right? They were very busy during COVID. They were investing in automation. They were investing in AI. Their universities are far superior than some Southeast Asian countries, believe it or not. Right? So I came back from China after that first trip. I sat down with my CEO. She said, what did you learn? I said, we have all these plans to diversify out of China, and we're going to execute these plans. I said, however, we're going to be smart about it, and we might need to slow down in certain areas, and let me tell you why, right? We launch anywhere from 6 to 7 products a year. We have to partner with contract manufacturers, original equipment, ODMs, right, JDMs, whatever you want to call them. And what you heard here is how we leverage partners. So Bose does a great job on working on what we consider our IP, our crown jewel, and we leverage partners for the other side. That can be manufacturing, process control, that can be anything from painting or finishing that we don't deem as critical, right? So a lot of that talent resides really in China and in Taiwan. I'll say those 2 countries have abundance of engineering core and capability, and what we found is as you start migrating outside of China, the manufacturing is there, okay, albeit not as advanced in certain areas, in certain industries. Everything I say is in the lens of consumer products, okay? I'm not talking about data servers and other things. That's not what we're talking about. I'm talking about a consumer product, which, if you guys haven't figured out, they're really labor intensive. They can be, which means there's a lot of people on lines, right? Which means there's training and there's knowledge and know-how that goes into making them. Certain levels can be automated, but certain levels can't. What we found is when you start really peeling the onion back and you look at countries outside of China in the consumer electronics lens, not as sophisticated as what I would say China and Taiwan. And because China is soft today, I have somewhat pumped the brakes a little bit on moving as fast as we would originally have planned. We had a plan to be, by the end of next year, I'd say 70% outside of China. We are a little bit behind. The reason we're behind is because there's only an abundance of engineering around in Bose and that we can leverage. And the most important thing is launching products on time and experiences to our consumers to stay relevant in the market. And for us to be able to do that, we need to leverage our partners and leverage those engineering capabilities as well as the manufacturing and the automation. Everything has to be looked at holistically, right? Our sourcing organization partners very closely with our engineering organization. We make decisions on who's going to get a piece of business, not only because of the price, not only because of the location, but also because of the engineering and what that partner can bring to us. All that gets put in a bucket and out comes, this is the best partner, this is the region of the world, this is where we're going to launch these products. So I'll just say that a little bit about China. But there is, you've heard geopolitical risk, another dirty word in my industry, right? Geopolitical risk. You've heard probably about China and Taiwan tensions. How many have heard about semiconductor crisis? Yeah, my Bose folks should be raising their hands, definitely. That is another big risk. And the other piece of risk and resiliency is you can create a supply chain as risk and resilient as you want. It comes at a cost. Risk and resiliency is not free. You heard a little bit about digital twins. You heard a little bit about how do you move away from those geopolitical tension countries and put them in other countries, right? There's all certain things you can do, but you have to do it calculated, right? And you have to be smart about it. I'll just take an example for semiconductors. TSMC in Taiwan control about 80 to 90% of the world's semiconductor market. If China invades Taiwan, there is nothing Dave Vitti or Bose is going to do about it. It will shut down. We'll be up here in a panel talking about global markets shut down. That's what will happen, okay? But what you see if you're reading and you're keeping up on this, manufacturing and fab locations are opening up in other areas of the world. Sounds great. Just move them. Not so easy. The CHIPS Act in the US is a great thing, right, for certain industries. For consumer electronics, it is not the greatest thing in the world because that comes at a 4x cost. So again, we can move chips from Taiwan, we can move them to the US, the cost will manifest itself in the product, and then the product cost and then ultimately will go up to the consumer. So you have to have a balance in the risk and resiliency strategies that you put in place. And I'll just end with what we're putting in place is certain things where, hey, we have fab locations or areas of the world we can go to if there's a crisis. That's one piece. There's certain technologies that I'll say they're commoditized that are dual sourced in many locations, and we can pivot on a dime, right? But not one size fits all. And that's one thing we're finding out, and we're putting a lot of plans in place and we're partnering. As you know, we're a consumer electronics company. A third of our business is also automotive. Partnering with the OEMs, making sure that the OEMs have risk and resiliency plans and we're answering them in a B2B market is very different than a B2C market. So a lot more to come there, and I'd be happy to come back and talk more about it, but It's all exciting. It's a little bit disruptive. And I love what I heard earlier in the first chat. If you want to solve problems, work in supply chain. Every day there's a problem to solve.
Thank you, David. I think that was great, the way you pulled together and also talked about some of the real challenges. It's one thing to write papers about it and teach people in class, but it's another thing to confront these challenges and solve them. I'm sure there's lots of questions here in this room, so perhaps we can have some show of hands, and there's a microphone that we can pass around. Great. So, yeah. Let me see. Oh, yeah, there we go. Sheila, yeah?
Yes, Sheila Puffer, faculty member in International Business and Strategy. You mentioned the solar panel industry, and would you please elaborate on what's been happening with Chinese companies coming in, setting up operations in the Midwest particularly, and those Chinese companies taking advantage of the IRA subsidies and tax credits? How does it all play out?
I wish I could say that I knew more about the solar panel industry, Sheila. But I think the key point that I was trying to make is that when you have a country, a nation that has 80% market share, similar to what David was talking about the semiconductor industry, that every country really should be concerned about becoming dependent on one country that has, I won't say monopolistic rights, but a lot of market control. And so here then we would think that hopefully countries and their institutions are aware of providing incentives for growing these domestic industries within country instead. So for example, we know within the US First Solar is one of our largest firms that is in the solar panel industry. So again, we would be thinking about what are the incentives and maybe that are being given to these Chinese companies that are coming in, but are we being fair to then our domestic firms and to everyone that wants to be a player? Because for consumers, right, ultimately, we benefit from competition, from having more firms and more countries being active in the marketplace. We don't benefit when we have more monopolistic rights, fewer players, that kind of thing. So I think the solar industry, the semiconductor industry, these are two great examples where we see certain countries having a lot of market share and power, and that I think it's only natural, I would hope, that countries like the US especially, because we live here, we probably see more about it, are aware that they need to kind of build their own infrastructure so that dependence doesn't get kind of out of line.
Hi, my question is to Fabricius. So what I wanted to ask is recently the BRICS has introduced a new form of currency, which is basically again in the BRICS nations, which is again like to reduce reliance on the dollar as a global currency. So how do you see that as like a future competition against the dollar, or how do you see the global market currencies evolving in terms of that?
Yes, very excellent question. I think one important feature to be borne in mind is scale and scalability. So when you are launching a new currency, you want to make sure that it has at least three important features. One, it should serve as a medium of exchange. Second, it should be a store of value. And lastly, it should be a unit of account. Now, if you think about cryptocurrencies, for instance, and the role of cryptocurrencies as a store of value, we've seen quite some issues with that in the past, even with stable coins that are allegedly pegged to the US dollar and that shouldn't break the buck. So I think my short answer to your question is you want to make sure that you have scalability and that you are able to fulfill these three features. After that, you can start to bolster your currency in certain ways. But before you are not fulfilling these three quasi sine qua nons, you can't move on as becoming a fair contestant to the US dollar.
Thank you.
And if I can add a word to that, there was the Bank for International Settlements, the BIS. The BIS recently offered the possibility of tokenization of global payments. In other words, you can still use the US dollar, the euro, the Japanese yen, but these would be converted into digital tokens, which would then avoid the whole idea of the way international payments works is you need to have correspondent banks, and then you need to have some kind of settlement between countries. And that would be bypassed because these would be digital tokens that would take place probably within a blockchain kind of environment. So they'd be very secure and instantaneous. And by the way, the cost today of doing global payments is probably around 3%. Okay, so 3% of the global payments economy is handed over to banks for managing that transaction transfer. So that's why the BIS is so interested. They would rather have the idea of a digital currency available to governments and therefore to corporations, and thus reduce the power of the parallel monetary system developing. And by the way, as far as Bitcoin goes, it was at zero at one point. Today it's worth somewhere between $60,000 to $70,000. So long term, it's been an incredible store of value. Though in the short term, of course, the fluctuations make it impossible for any company to say, I'm going to price in Bitcoin. Because if you do, then you'd have to hedge, and that adds a cost, et cetera, et cetera. But my short answer is, I don't think digital payments are going to go away. They're very efficient and very cost effective. And so there's likely to be evolution of the technology, but I don't know if it's going to be a private sector solution such as a Bitcoin or a stable coin, or if it's going to be a government-sponsored solution with tokenization of fiat currencies.
Sonia Roland, I'm a faculty at the law school here. I want to come back to the risk and resiliency issues and supply chain issues. And here I'm thinking of climate-related resiliency. And it seems to me there's kind of a push and pull in two different directions, right? We know enhanced climate crisis impose additional costs, right, on supply chains, and they create risk, and they make insurance more costly or even impossible. At the same time, we have this AI revolution that is a massive energy guzzler. And so long as we haven't figured out how to produce energy in a climate-friendly way, then how do we deal with those sort of conflicting business requirements, really? Because you have to have both, right? Stable supply chains, but also AI, access to AI.
Sure, I'll start and then you can jump in. So no, it's a real, I like how you described it, it's a real push and pull, right? I think climate change and sustainability is taking a forefront, and AI is slowly, like really fast right behind it. And things take more energy and more time and more investment. And I will say that I think companies that say technologically advanced and look at ways to mitigate as much as they can on the climate change side and sustainability will have some left. And they have to, right? It's not gonna go away. But AI can also be an enabler of that. AI is fairly, at least at Bose, it is fairly, it's fairly new for us. We're accessing in certain areas, but in other areas we're not. And with regards to sustainability and climate change, we're making calculated investments in certain areas and how we partner and report on that. We're able to do that because we're a privately held company, right? So it's a little bit different for us. When you're a publicly traded company, or if you're an automotive OEM, you have to answer a lot more in those areas. So for us, it's a balance. It's a healthy balance of what's the investment, is the juice worth the squeeze, so to speak, and then how do we make sure before we leverage this thing called AI, how can we really use it? How can we protect IP and things along those lines?
Mm-hmm.
Just to take off on a slightly different direction, because most people in the room probably have no conception of what's evolving in terms of sustainability reporting. So a company that I'm on the board of decided it wanted to make a significant investment in AI, develop its own models, its own language for its own space. And what we ran into was the reporting requirements. The reporting requirements today, in order to qualify as a supplier to major international companies, in order to, in the not too distant future, be listed on a major stock exchange, involve not only estimating, but calculating to the extent you can, all your emissions that your company makes, down to literally how much energy you use washing the dishes in the company cafeteria to all the emissions that your suppliers make, and soon it will be all the emissions your suppliers make. So for one company I'm on the board of, our ESG report is now 3 times the size of the annual report. And so what's happening is any of these investments are not only are critical, as David was saying, but they've also upped the reporting requirements astronomically. And what it's doing in a number of industries is it's eliminating small companies. I know of one firm that actually has gone around to all the customers for that industry and pushed them to have even more stringent environmental reporting requirements for their suppliers in order to drive competitors out of business, right? So this is really getting complex.
I was going to add, Sonia, that the second part of your question, I think, is something very, very relevant and important for us, which is that to harness AI, we need a lot of power. And we see firms like Google and Microsoft striking new partnerships now to launch new nuclear power plants. And that, again, has ramifications to the communities that are near these plants, to the environment, to safety and regulation, right? We need to up our game if we're going to be opening a lot of these new things, which there's clearly demand for because we all want access to AI now. Businesses, not only are we as consumers dependent upon it, businesses are dependent upon it. And so I think if we see these giant players really being the catalyst for more energy resources, it's something that governments are going to have to be involved in because there has to be checks and balances. So I'm looking to see what happens based on these just new contracts that Google and Microsoft have struck.
And I think fundamentally, if you think of resilience, it's predictability versus the cost and revenue impacts. And I think, David, we were having a conversation earlier about that, about it's very easy in some ways to say, oh, I can be resilient by changing or duplicating or even making triple the number of locations. But that in turn adds more complexity and raises costs significantly so that your revenue, your top line maybe gets hurt. So I don't know if that's something that you want to comment on, this idea of resilience versus the economic impact of trying to be resilient.
Sure. I touched a little bit on it earlier, but to Ravi's point, I'll just take a component, right? We'll start with a component and then a product. To dual or triple source a component is much easier than it is to do a product, right? So we can start there. So if you take a semiconductor, you can have it manufactured in Taiwan. You can also have a fab that will manufacture that in, say, Japan, okay? So you have a pretty resilient process, right, those two. However, to get that part qualified in Japan takes at least 8 months. That takes engineering work to do that, right? That's cost, that's opportunity cost of engineers who could be working on the next greatest tech or the next greatest product, right? So these are the decisions you have to make. Conversely, to dual source a product is equally as hard, if not harder, right? Depending on the region you want to do it. You set up a manufacturing line, you launch a product. You then have to rip that line down or duplicate that line and move it to another region and do that. That takes probably about 12 months to do that, right? And all this time and money, to Ravi's point, companies and organizations are contemplating, well, what am I not going to work on, right? What is the thing that we're not going to be able to offer to the consumer? So these are the checks and balances that we have to make and the discussions and trade-offs that we have. We put a lot on our supply base. Right? We heard earlier about the partner leverage. We put a lot on them to go do this work for us. But there's only so much they can do. Because at the end of the day, it says Bose on the product. The reliability of that product, right? The experience that product delivers is on Bose. It is not on the component suppliers. So everything in balance. Some resiliency plays are easier than others, right? Components, if fabs are exactly the same, if it's a drop-in replacement, we can move on a dime. If it's not, there's much higher complexity sub-assemblies or fit and finish products that are more manual. Those are what take time and harder to do. And quite frankly, there's certain components that you might never get to, we make decisions that we will not be dual sourced or triple sourced to be resilient in this area. And that is a decision we're willing to make and a risk that companies are willing to take. And that's not just Bose, that's across the consumer electronics realm.
Hello, thank you so much for coming to speak to us today. I just wanted to touch on a point, since we're talking about tokenization of assets and potentially BRICS bringing in their own currency. Do you think the private sector in the US or the US government is taking good enough steps to combat China becoming technologically superior to US in some areas, such as maybe like solar production, like solar panels production, and electric vehicles? So, yeah.
Well, I'll start on the technology side. Clearly, the current administration is investing heavily, is putting a lot of money out. One of the challenges there is that a lot of that money is the steps, the hoops you have to go through to spend it have so many restrictions that many companies are simply not bothering. So there's a will there, but in the implementation, it's getting pretty bizarre. In terms of what's moving in China, AI, certainly facial recognition, China's way ahead of the US. In terms of implementing EVs, China's way ahead of the US. Tesla is probably still the technology leader, but the ability to produce large volume, low cost, China is by far ahead. In terms of use of e-marketing, influencers, China is way ahead, not even close. Companies like P&G in the US, they have to send people to China now to learn how to do that stuff in the world's most advanced market for it, and then bring them back to the US. So some of it is out of our control. China's 14th five-year plan is a very clear move away from headline economic growth as a main objective. And the main objective, full stop, is first technological self-sufficiency and then technological superiority. The Made in China 2025 program, announced in 2015, had 10 major technology areas where under, and with state support and under state guidance, China listed targets first for dominating the domestic market and then dominating the international market. They've backed away from those words because that's like not a good thing under WTO. But I can tell you those programs are rolling right ahead. I've been involved in actually designing some of the industrial parks to do it. The amount of investment is absolutely staggering. It is a new challenge, quite frankly, of the sort that the US and Western Europe hasn't seen before. The US can compete, that's great. Whether the restrictions, technology restrictions, will work or not, yet to be seen. But we ought to expect that there is going to be, technological competition, for the next however long. And then questions like Sheila's with solar panels. What happens if you want solar panels for environmental reasons, and you just don't have any companies that are still in the business because they've been driven out by state-supported competitors? You got a choice. Either you bring the foreign competitors in and let them use the subsidies to build in the US, or you may not have companies that could actually produce the solar panels that you want for other purposes. So these are the types of trade-offs that get made.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Get in the back, yeah.
Hi, first of all, thank you for taking your time to talk to us. My name is Michael. I'm a finance major from Brazil. My question is targeted to David. Since you were talking about Bose's close relationship with the Chinese market and trying to expand operations over there, over the last few weeks, the Chinese government has introduced some stimulus packages and programs to stimulate their economy, hopefully start a bull run. They also introduced the relending program, which injected around $100 billion to their economy. Do you see this as an advantage to Bose, like a new opportunity to go back to their market? And what are the main risks of this stimuli program that they introduced? What are the ways that could potentially go wrong?
It's a great question. I think on the sales side, it's a great opportunity for both. So obviously China is our third largest market from a sales perspective. We have some pretty aggressive and lofty goals for this year in China and next year to double our revenue in those markets. So this stimulus package is only going to help us on the sales side. What that does and how that affects the manufacturing and the labor rates and things like that, it could have an adverse effect. We don't know yet, right? But if I go back to what we talked about the risk resiliency side, we're making sure we're diversified enough that we have products outside of China, that we have dual footprints outside of China, that we could maybe weather a negative impact that it might have on labor rates and talent and other things in those areas. But as far as the stimulus, from a top line revenue perspective, it's going to be great for Bose. It's going to be great for other consumer electronic companies. Anybody wanting to sell in China, we're super excited about it, and we have lofty goals to do that. And the China market is different. Obviously, the population is huge. How we market, Devika probably knows this, is very different. And we're coming out with products that are more specifically tailored to that market and marketing campaigns for that market, which stimulus will only help that.
Great. Thank you all. Reaching the end of our session. Great questions, great audience. And I particularly want to thank David for taking the time to come from Bose, from his busy schedule, and Professors Fabrizio Somogyi, Professor Samina Karim, and Professor Mike Enright for giving us the benefits of their research and knowledge in a very succinct fashion. Thank you all.